I will briefly introduce the people who are part of our launch of the third of our Shifting Sands reports. Now, this is Shifting Sands, Confounded, oh good heavens, we got a title and a subtitle, and I need to get them all right. This is our report on COVID, everyone. We're talking about public health policy with a statistical study of what it is. The three report authors are Stan Young, who is the director of the National Association of Scholars Shifting Sands Project, Warren Kinzierski, former professor at the School of Public Health at the University of Alberta, Edmonton, and yours truly, NAS Director of Research. Our two commenters for today are John Sanders, who is Director of the Center for Food, Power, and Life at the John Locke Foundation in North Carolina, and Scott Turner, my colleague, the NAS Director of the Intrusion of Diversity into the Sciences Project. Now, this is the third of our Shifting Sands reports. These are all studies of the irreproducibility crisis, and particularly using a particular means of statistics to study how government has gotten its regulations wrong, its policies wrong in a variety of different areas. The first report was about PM 2.5 regulation, studying the Environmental Protection Agency in particular. The second one, flimsy food findings, was about nutritional epidemiology, and in particular, how the Food and Drug Administration works. And this one is about COVID policy, and above all, therefore, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Now, that's the background for the reports. Let me just give you a sort of a quick overview of what is going on in COVID. And let me just say, I speak first, quick overview, ideally no more than 10 minutes. We'll then get 12 to 15 minutes apiece from each, Dr. Warren Kinzierski, Dr. Stan Young. There will then be comments from John Sanders and Scott Turner. Then it will be open up to Q&A from the public, and that means you. You will provide your questions into, I would say I would prefer the chat button, but the Q&A button also works. So either will work. If you will go into chat, by the way, you will now see a link to the report in question on Shifting Sands. Send in your questions. I will try to be the moderator. Sometimes people can talk directly. Do not worry if your question doesn't get answered. Send it to me, randall@nas.org, RANDALL @nas.org, and I'd be delighted to forward any question you have to anybody, any co-author, any participant, panel participant. And also, don't worry if you can't finish watching this. This will be on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel within 24 hours in perpetuity. Now, that's all the business. Let me just go quickly then to the introduction and a sort of an overall survey of what this report is about. And what this report is about, obviously, is the COVID-19 epidemic, which, March 11th, 2020, the World Health Organization declares COVID-19 a pandemic. In the next years, public health professionals largely formed the policy responses to this pandemic. And in most developed countries, there was a strategy of suppression or rigorous control regimes. And what this meant includes widespread COVID-19 virus testing, contact tracing, isolating, use of face masks in public, physical distancing, lockdowns, closed schools and stay-at-home orders, limitations on mass gatherings, and improved ventilation systems at workplaces. Some of you out there may remember this. It was not in the too distant past. The public health professionals' consensus strategy critically assumed that COVID-19 itself was the great driver of mortality, and that COVID-19 fatality rates were very high across a broad range of population subsets, and that these policies could substantially alter COVID-19 mortality. And these three assumptions were used to justify the recommendations that as much of the general population as possible isolate itself in individual and family groups indefinitely, regardless of other costs. But, and it's a big but, the COVID-19 virus is not the plague or the Spanish flu. It is, in effect, a very ordinary new respiratory virus. It has a rather low case fatality rate. Over time, it has become less lethal and more infectious, in line with viral evolutionary thinking. And the historical wisdom for dealing with a new virus is protect the weak, let natural immunity lead to herd immunity. And COVID-19 infections were lethal primarily to elderly persons with comorbidities, but public health officials sold it to the public, to all of us, as a lethal danger to one and all. These mistakes of COVID-19 public health policy are part and parcel of the larger irreproducibility crisis. Scientists' use of flawed statistics and editors' complacent practices both contribute to the mass production and publication of irreproducible research in a wide range of scientific disciplines. Far too many researchers use unsound scientific practices. Now, NAS has been on this beat for a while. First, the irreproducibility crisis of modern science back in 2018. For the last few years, our Shifting Sands project, which particularly looks how irreproducible science negatively affects select areas of government policy and regulation. So this is us studying COVID. The technical studies, and by the technical studies, I mean my very esteemed colleagues, Dr. Young and Dr. Kinzierski, they're the ones who did the technical studies, hat off to them. They focused on two aspects of non-pharmaceutical intervention response to the COVID-19 pandemic: lockdowns and masking, which were both meant to reduce COVID-19 infections and fatalities. And they're using a novel statistical technique, p-value plotting, as a severe test to study specific claims made about the benefit to the public health outcomes of these responses. And they found persuasive circumstantial evidence that lockdowns and masking had no proven benefit to public health outcomes. And these technical studies suggest a far greater frailty, which is a polite way of saying failure, in the system of epidemiological modeling and policy recommendations. That system generally grossly overestimated the potential effects of COVID-19 and particularly overestimated the potential benefits of lockdown and masking. So we believe these technical studies support recommendations for policy change to restructure the entire system of government policy based on epidemiological modeling, and not just to apply cosmetic reforms to the existing system. Now, the report, Confounded Errors, brings into focus the deep connection between the irreproducibility crisis and the radical activist state by its focus on intervention degrees of freedom, a concept we are coining here. And Americans have ceded governmental authority to professionals who claim the mantle of scientific authority. The irreproducibility crisis in government is the intervention crisis. Intervention degrees of freedom mean the freedom of radical activists and federal bureaucracies to make policy unrestrained by law, prudence, consideration of collateral damage, offsetting priorities, our elected representatives, or public opinion. This is reasonably big. Now, what should be done? And my colleagues are going to talk about this also, and perhaps in some detail, but we have a series of recommendations to the CDC, to the government generally, to the modeling profession, and to Americans as a whole. about public interventions. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because I say will be said later, but commissions should be established to set boundaries on the areas of private life, which may be the subject of public health intervention. The scope of public health interventions should be explicitly defined to deal with physical health, narrowly and carefully defined. Public health interventions should be required to receive explicit sanction from both houses of Congress. A bunch of technical recommendations on how to reform epidemiological mathematical modeling, including pre-registration of studies, transparency and reproducibility of mathematical modeling, explicit rules to reduce intervention degrees of freedom, guidelines that make explicit that modeling quantifies uncertainty of action rather than prescribes certainty to justify action. And then ultimately an entire commission to look at everything which was done in the name of COVID-19 public health policy. There is a lot to criticize about COVID-19 public health policy, and Americans have been levying charges of bad faith, politicized misconduct, hysteria. I had all of our public health establishment from Anthony Fauci on down. Our report doesn't speak directly to these charges, but it certainly supports the contention that the federal government, should establish a commission to undertake a full-scale investigation and report on the origins and nature of COVID-19, as well as of public health policy errors committed during the response to COVID-19 by the CDC. Now, our report bolsters the case for all sorts of reforms of procedures within science policy in the government, and indeed a new approach to science policy generally. Americans must work to understand fully the connections between the irreproducibility crisis and the radical activist state, to recognize the wide-ranging intervention crisis as a political problem of the first magnitude, and to draft policy solutions that will reassert the primacy of law, elected representatives, and the public over the arbitrary actions of these Lysenkos in government service, who pretend to be Lavoisiers. We must perform not only the procedures of scientific research, but also the procedures and powers of government expertise. Now that's me for my overview, and I'm going to get to the substance, which justifies anything I may have said by way of assertion. And for the substance, Drs. Kinzierski, and Young, how would you like to do this?
Well, I'll start, and then Stan will follow up and finish the presentation. Is that fine?
Sure.
Okay. Okay, so David has given a very thorough introduction of the work that we did. So what we're going to present here is primarily a focus on the scientific aspects of trying to identify confounded errors in COVID-19 health policy decisions. Next slide. So David largely discussed the methods that we used. We used p-value plots, very straightforward method where we take risk statistics from meta-analyses. These include risk ratios or relative risks, odds ratios, and confidence intervals, and we convert them to p-values. We then present them in a plot to look at the distribution of these statistics. And that distribution can tell us a lot about what the evidence is suggesting. Next slide. This is a very revealing slide by Stan. Bunnies in the sky largely refers to looking at large complex data sets and finding random or rare outcomes. But it's just by simply gazing at clouds. What we did is essentially looking at bunnies in the sky and COVID data that lead to confounded errors. Next slide. A bit about meta-analysis background. It's a statistical method that analyzes and combines results of multiple scientific studies. It's rather highly respected in the hierarchy of evidence-based medical studies. And if you look at the right-hand side, what it first involves a systematic review where the literature is searched for individual studies, all focused on answering a single research question. These studies are evaluated qualitatively, and that's those triangles going into the hopper, and out comes a selected list of individual studies that are subject to the analytical component, that quantitative analysis. A skilled team of meta-analysis researchers, say a dozen researchers, could churn out one meta-analysis per week. And in fact, about 5,000 meta-analysis studies are published each year. However, studies that are poorly designed lead to erroneous statistics and confounding errors. Next slide. So these are some examples of expected behavior of p-value plots. On the left-hand side is a plot for actually results from a single study converted into p-values, asking the question of whether eating cereal during pregnancy leads to more boy births. When we see an approximate 45-degree line in the plot, it's providing evidence of randomness or no association. On the right-hand side is evidence of a real association. That particular plot is a meta-analysis of smoking lung cancer studies. What we see is most of the p-values are very, very small. And this study had 102 studies that were converted to p-value. We do see some null results on the very far left-hand side, but largely a very strong evidence that, that there is a real association between the two variables, smoking and lung cancer. Last thing is research claims for p-value plots that look something different than what we're seeing here are simply should be regarded as suspect. And I'll show you an example of that shortly. Next plot, slide. This study is of lockdowns and mortality, was conducted or led by Steve Hank from Johns Hopkins University. And actually, they took this study and expanded it and published a book that was released in May by the Institute of Economic Affairs. And that particular study was a research claim where Hank concluded that lockdowns in the spring of 2020 had little or no effect. Now, if we look at the plot itself, a best fit line would be much closer to a 45-degree line than a line with a very, very shallow slope. And in fact, most of the p-values are nulls, that is to say greater than 0.5. And it supports this particular plot supports the finding of Hank that lockdowns had no effect. Next slide, please. This is a study of incidents of domestic violence, published in 2021. It had a rather bizarre research claim that was made. that lockdowns have no detrimental effect on mental health. And in fact, people are psychologically resilient to lockdowns. If we look at the p-values, we actually see two lines if you want it to fit the data. A line with a very shallow slope for the p-values less than 0.5, and then a line with p-value nulls, which approximate 45. This type of behavior is clearly different from the expected behavior for a null association or a true association. And at best, one could conclude that that there's evidence of a, oh, just wait. Chance, you advanced too far. There should be one slide prior. There you go. Sorry about that. So this particular study was looking at mental health symptoms. This is the one that had the bizarre claim that lockdowns had no effect on mental health and that people are resilient to lockdowns. This particular p-value plot shows two lines, as I said before. And the expected behavior, this is different from the expected behavior of a null or a real association. So as I said before, at best we conclude is that we have a study which has an unproven claim. Can you advance to the next slide? This is the one of incidents of domestic violence. This particular claim is that domestic violence increased in response to lockdowns. This particular study had 17 p-values, 14 of which were less than 0.5 and 4 nulls. This particular plot is suggesting to us that this is showing a real association between the two variables, lockdowns and incidents of domestic violence. Now, the last thing I'll say is that from our report, we have a published study of lockdowns in the International Journal of Statistics and Probability that provides more technical details of what we presented here. Stan, I'll turn the presentation over to you.
Stan, I think you're muted still.
We're going to talk about masks, and I was rather taken in by the whole thing at the very beginning, and I thought the powers that be were being honest. So I had my wife make for me a cloth mask, and you see myself with the cloth mask here. I'm hooded up and I'm greatly protected. So let's go to the next slide. This is a history, just a quick snapshot history of what's going on. The virus is really much smaller than the pore size of a mask. So if a person smokes a cigarette and blows it through a mask, it just goes right through it. And virus particles are 30 times smaller than the pore size. So there's no real physical reason to think that masks are going to work at all. Ineffective, masks were ineffective for the Spanish flu. Biowarfare people published a paper in 2006 saying that masks are ineffective. They also said lockdowns were ineffective. And even initially, Dr. Fauci opined that, well, you don't have to worry about masks because they're ineffective. So the history going into this thing was that masks and lockdowns were essentially completely ineffective. Next slide. So how did it happen that we got into this? Well, this was claimed that this is a new virus. Well, viruses are all about the same size. Most of them are. And this one was not unusually large in any particular way. So there was nothing about the fact that this is a virus or a new virus that really should have impinged on anyone's thinking. Math models projected very dire results. Ferguson, the guy that did the math modeling over in England, has math modeled several things before, and basically he's always gotten it wrong. He's always projected many more dire things than actually happened. He projected a very high death rate, which, as David has said, was not the case. And then let's flatten the curve. Let's stretch out the attack of the virus so that the hospitals can cope. So that was the sort of the justification. Next slide. I was, by this time, I was fully engaged, and I was rather taken aback by the North Carolina Department of Public Health, how they were handling this. They said in particular, peer-reviewed evidence, the protective effect against the face mask and respiratory virus infection and so forth is overwhelming. The evidence is overwhelming. Well, I looked at the data and I looked at the papers, and if anything, there was nothing overwhelming about it at all. I actually talked to John Saunders about this and published a paper, this last paper here, October 2020. The Swedish and later the Florida strategy came up, and the head of HSS for North Carolina was asked in a press conference whether she was going to have her math modelers deal with the Swedish strategy. She very curtly said no, turned on her heel, and left. So she knew about it. She answered very promptly, but she left. She didn't do it. And multiple contacts. I contacted her. She eventually assigned me to a lower level person, and I contacted all of the advisors to HSS, and I got absolutely nowhere. They did not change their strategy whatsoever. Next slide. It's going to be 1, 2, 3 strikes and you're out. The first strike of the multiple of the p-value plots. Each dot represents a particular study. The lower dots in the lower left-hand corner represent studies that represent some level of evidence for the claim that's being made. Any dot above the dotted line is not statistically significant. And if the dots fall on a 45-degree line, it says that we're looking at simple randomness. One of the first things in science you have to do is you have to beat randomness. If you don't beat randomness, you move on to something else. Here we have 2 slides, 2 sets. The first one is Tom Jefferson in Oxford, renowned expert on mask, and he published a paper in 2020, republished a paper in 2022. It had tremendous fights with the powers that be, that his assessment that there was no benefit was the valid assessment, and there was no end of consternation between him and the people that were trying to push the mask paradigm. A later study by Liu came to the same conclusion. Next slide, strike 2. Let's go to strike 2 next. Denmark started a very large clinical trial, randomized clinical trial. They carefully coached the people how to wear masks and so forth and so on. The sample size was huge, 3,000 in each group. The end effect of that was that they could detect no benefit from masks whatsoever. So we've got 2 strikes against masks. Let's go to the 3rd strike in the next slide. Here are the Germans and the Swedes. This is great. Warren found this. On the left-hand side, we see the level of mask usage. The Germans, being typical Germans that they are, were very, very thorough about what they were doing, and they had over 80% mask usage during the whole time of the second wave. The Swedes had already declared that they thought this was sort of a nothing burger, to quote Hillary, and they never got really very much above 20%. So we've got 80% mask usage versus 20% mask usage. If we look on the right-hand side, we see traces of deaths during the second wave. The second wave goes up, comes down, bounces a little bit, and comes back down. And you'll notice the gray on top of the black. The gray curve is for Sweden, and the black curve is for Germany. And they just follow each other. So this is an experiment. Nationwide experiment. Two countries use very similar in their demographics and so forth. And the third strike is the mask did nothing to slow or flatten the curve at all. Next slide. David has talked about what should be done. There should be an independent commission. I will jump in here in a little political and say, let's underline the word independent. If the government is part of the problem, they are hardly independent. If the universities have been supporting the policy all the way through, they are hardly independent. There are a number of independent experts that have done blogs and Substacks and so forth. Those are the people that really need to be in here, or at least part of the commission. David has mentioned limiting public health to physical interventions. We also mentioned that there should be oversight, and the oversight itself has to be independent. Both houses of Congress, the various congressional committees should go in here. And then we can go way back to the founding fathers. Whenever you have a complicated situation where politics is involved, you need to divide power. It's only because Florida acted on its own that we have a good representation of what could have gone on. The Swedish and the Florida thing are a result, really, of divided power. Next slide. This is these are technical suggestions, and people often level their suggestions to the scientists. If only you would do it better, then the life would be better. You have to realize that scientists are people too. They will look out after their own self-interest. So I keep telling people there are no science cops. The scientists will try and publish, they'll get grants and so forth. But if you go to someone who is doing well in what he's doing and say, you really need to change so that you'll do better for other people, you should expect scientists to do well for themselves, not necessarily for the rest of the people. So there has to be some level of independent oversight on what the scientists are doing. Actually, Eric Lander was head of the OSTP, Office of Science and Technology at the White House, and he laid out exactly what the scientists ought to be doing. For his trouble, he was ushered out the door, but he said what everyone says. Post your protocol, make your data available, make your code available, things like that. But as there are no science cops, no one's holding you to that. So we know, based on expert opinion, what should be done. It's not being done, however. Let's go to the next slide. Long term, the origins of COVID need to be figured out. I've read, over the course of this study, I read 3 or 4 books on that, and I don't think the public is fully informed as to what's going on. there's an interaction, and David has talked about this, and Warren and I have talked about it. There's an interaction between mathematical models and the public health intelligentsia. And the public health people, again, are looking out initially, or primarily, not necessarily primarily, but their first look out is for their own selves. And so only if they publish their papers and their algorithms and make them public can there be independent oversight as to what they're doing. We should not defer to the experts. The experts didn't do very well this time. I'll mention just briefly government media censoring and the narrative and narrative pushing. There's been a lot of that, and because there's been so much censoring, I don't think the public realizes exactly how much of it there has been going on. So let's go to the next slide. Oh, this is great. Winston Churchill said during the Second World War, when he had a thorny problem, the Germans never let a crisis go to waste. So what he meant by that is that if there's a crisis going on, if you need to get 3 or 4 things done, pull them in and get them done during a crisis, because people are more likely to go along with you. And then the next one is, this was said in the 30s by H.L. Mencken. The whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed and hence clamorous to be led to safety by menacing it with an endless series of hobgoblins, all of them imaginary. And as David has mentioned, and we discovered very soon during the, we looked at the data coming out of Italy, this is a common virus. There's nothing special about it at all. It's small like other viruses. It's transmitted by airborne things like other viruses. And the case fatality rate is very low. And as David mentioned, focused almost entirely in the old with comorbidities. The average death age due to COVID in Italy was 81. The average death age in Italy is 81. So there was no difference. Switch to the last slide and next slide, yeah. Oh, no, let's go back one. I'm sorry. This is a good lawsuit that you ought to be following. The state of Louisiana and the state of Missouri sued our friend Joseph R. Biden Jr. And the judge did 2 things. The judge allowed the attorney generals for these states to do a discovery. That meant the lawyers could ask people, please send me this, please send me that, and so forth. In many other instances, discovery was not allowed, but it was allowed here. And with discovery, they uncovered a treasure trove of communication between the government, various government agencies, and social media. And that led to enormous lockdowns, projection of particular narratives, and so forth. So this is not me talking, this is the attorney generals gathering data. And although Warren and I had to deal with it because we found it difficult at times to get good data. We couldn't get good data because the good data was being suppressed. Let's turn to if the political cartoonist can understand what's going on, government actually threatened the social media companies. If you don't do this, we're going to do that. So when a political cartoonist gets into the action and has a sense of what's going on, scientists can kind of back off and just let the thing take its course. Last slide. I want to look at the second one, Pogue, 2023. This just came out. 3 epidemiologists located surprisingly in San Francisco at a university went through publications that came out of the CDC. They looked at 77 different publications, all dealing with COVID, all but one dealing with COVID. Not one of those publications cited a negative paper. All were positive, all were all in on mask work and lockdowns work. This is incredible. This paper should be read. It's on a MedRVX, and it really delves into, along with the lawsuit, delves into what scientists on our side of the street were dealing with in terms of dealing with this problem. I'll stop there. I've probably taken too much time, but it's been a fascinating area to study.
Thank you so much. So you've now heard from the 3 presentations of the report. I'd like to now go to our panelists. I'm going to be drearily dull and go for alphabetical order. Mr. Sanders, would you care to go first?
Sure. I'm going to attempt to share my screen, and I will beg your patience if there is some operator error here. But let's see if this works. Let's see, click share. And of course, I'm already at the base. Okay. Are we good?
Great.
So I thank you for the opportunity to comment on this study. I think it's extremely important. I was very intrigued by the p-value plotting, that approach of analysis. The MTMM that was used here, I think, is very useful, and I think it really hits at the problem that is described in the 3 reports out of the 4 so far on the crisis of irreproducibility. And that's a word I've practiced saying before I came out here. But I thought especially of COVID, and I described it here as a crucible of the crisis of irreproducibility, because everything happened so fast. This was just a supercharged approach to this exact problem. And as you described it in the report, you know, it's improper methods in studies. It's a lack of accountability among the researchers and among the journals. It's obvious groupthink, bias and dishonesty, a tendency toward praising novelty, you know, something, a new exciting finding, which should prompt skepticism instead of excitement, and several other things. But beyond that, the crisis as described in the report and in the previous reports is that they become the basis of government regulation. And this is a problem for many reasons, most specifically being that the nature of regulation. The rise of the administrative state in the 20th century, I think, has been one of the greatest threats to the American conception of individual liberty and to our separation of powers. Essentially, Congress, which is the lawmaking body, ceded some of their authority to make laws to the executive agencies, which are, you know, executive branch, in order to interpret and enact the laws that they have passed. But the executive branches, being what they are, took that authority and ran with it. And it's become a bigger and bigger problem. And the Biden administration has especially been very eager to use administrative power as opposed to lawmaking. A proposed law, very few proposed laws per year get passed. Nearly every proposed regulation proceeds into effect. So that is part of the problem. Then you add on to the aspect, this emergency powers, and then suddenly we have the COVID crisis. So I refer to this as a irreproducibility crisis in overdrive. As Stan and Warren have talked about, old findings were kind of overthrown. The old findings on masks, what we've known on masks, even as what Fauci talked about, Dr. Fauci talked about at the early hours of the COVID crisis he went back on. It was well known that masks just were not effective in fighting infection by viruses, and it's like trying to stop a mosquito with a net. You're just not going to do it. And then not only that, but they were suspect. Any new findings were suspect because they were counter to what the regime obviously wanted to do. Early on, there were people there were researchers doctors coming out saying, "Look, I'm finding that ivermectin seems to help, or a regime of vitamin D and some other medications." They were immediately shut down. The Great Barrington Declaration, which essentially took the old ways of fighting, and the tried and true ways of fighting a novel pandemic. They were, and this came out in the Missouri v. Biden case, and some of the findings in that was how the government worked with the journals, worked with scientists, worked with media, and social media especially, to shut them down and hound that out of polite society. So we had this unprecedented emergency with low standard of expectations for the benefits of these new approaches, of lockdowns, of the masks especially. And I say in these comments that the precautionary principle was weaponized for its putative public health benefits. And what I mean by that is that people were so inflamed and worried that they bought on, they grasped on out of fear that these trusted health officials, these trusted government officials would not be making these grand promises if they didn't have something to back it up. So they were angry when someone was clearly not walking around masked. If people broke quarantine or they complained about it, we had protests in downtown Raleigh, and the police even tried to shut it down and declare protesting a non-essential activity. They were widely shamed for that, and a rare moment of sense here. But yeah, people just latched on to the idea that if this could help, and why couldn't it, then everyone should do it. And I mentioned already the coordination between government and scientists, scientific journals, media, and social media in all of this. So I'm kind of, ironically referring to science and data, because it was something that was just driven day after day after day. The science and data, as if it were holy writ, and unbeknownst to discussing what science actually is. And it's something that I really appreciate, by the way, authors, in your recommendations. You discuss, I think, in this third set on discussions of your commissions, that I'm going to quote from you welcome divisions of opinion with a minority and majority reports. The public should welcome and be accustomed to the idea that experts disagree. I cannot praise that highly enough, because we were given for 3 years the idea that experts don't disagree, that the science is the science, as Fauci said, and that science is somewhat set in stone, and all of this was false, and it fed into the mania that we had to deal with. So this aspect of science is holy writ almost excused extreme emergency powers, which were restricting civil liberties. Like Dr. Young, I questioned the masking being ordered by our governor in North Carolina and the State Department of Health and Human Services, whose head now is now in charge of the CDC, Mandy Cohen. God help us all. But I wrote about Dr. Young's discussions with DHHS, and they sent me a list of 22 studies. And so I think they wanted to bury me with data, but instead I wanted to go through it because nobody else had seen these. And I wanted to go through it for everybody visiting the Locke Foundation site. And I applied one simple test to each of the studies. Does this provide not just evidence that masking might work? Does it provide enough evidence that it would justify an extreme emergency order against people? Because the orders weren't, the governor, the health secretary at any point in time could have come forward and said, the science that we're saying suggests that everyone should be masked, and then leave it up to everybody. And then maybe provide that science on their website and give information on it. Instead, they didn't do that. They didn't show the research. They just said the research says that masking could be beneficial, therefore you must mask. And at some point in time in his orders, the governor even urged people to start snitching and letting officials know, letting business owners know if someone's walking around without a mask. And I just thought, this is not America. So should a free society tolerate liberties being violated, even if there were good research? See, I don't even go for that. So I differ a little bit with one of the recommendations there, but I think that if the research is strong enough, that people are smart enough that they'll voluntarily modify their behavior. But certainly no uncertain research should be basis for government over abuse of power the way that we've seen it. But I think that the authors have put forward some very positive, significant, solid steps to bring about convincing, compelling research findings. And that way, people should be able to know what to do with that. Unfortunately, we saw a lot of unintended negative consequences. I'm going to have to move this. I can't see my own notes. There we go. As you guys had mentioned, and so I'm not going to spend much time on it, that the government assumed that the COVID was greatly lethal. Therefore, their mandated interventions would be greatly helpful and avert a substantial number of deaths. But they rejected prior tested understandings of how to deal with the pandemic, and they even made public enemies out of the people who signed the Great Barrington Declaration about it. And they required basically just a modicum of research, anything that would just give them a hint in the direction that they wanted to go in terms of lockdowns, in terms of masking, whatever. But these caused a multitude of harms, hardships, jobs lost, family problems, health problems. People avoided going to the doctors. Either the doctors were not accepting patients or doing their normal checkups, especially in the early days of COVID, or people were afraid to be close to the doctors because they were afraid they might encounter someone who's sick. Many other things, much more. And it also damaged public trust in institutions of public health. And that's something we're going to have to deal with going forward. So I appreciated the recommendations coming out of this report because they put forward really what I considered sensible behavior in science and regulation going forward. Government must use the best science, and researchers must use the best methods regardless of results. That makes perfect sense to me. It's the sort of thing that shouldn't even need to be said. But unfortunately, especially after COVID, obvious things need to be said. Government must protect the civil liberties and trust people with full information. So the idea of the Liberty Commission I thought was great. I like the idea that we would limit the reach of potential emergency regulations into private lives so that we are not put into this position again by government flying blind and on uncertain ideas. Strictly limiting the scope to physical health and narrowly and carefully defining that, again, very important. I think especially limiting the interventions and receiving explicit sanctions from both houses of Congress. The more people who have their eyes on these things, the better, because this is America. One person, one agency should not have that great control over people. Your modeling recommendations are wonderful, so that we rely on modeling, not made to fit biases or agendas or data, or especially made to fit data after the fact, requiring transparency, reproducibility, revising them as time goes by. I thought that was a really important addition, something that really would have served the public well under COVID, because the initial studies that came out, I remember there was studies in New York City and Italy that said, the minute we added the masks, cases dropped off significantly. The problem was cases had already reached their initial peak. And the reason they dropped off after the mask was that the mask just happened to be timed with the peak ever having fallen. And if those studies had been revisited, and those findings had been revisited as more data was accrued, maybe we'd have had a better results from our public policy makers. So I praise this report. I think it's really well done, and I commend it to everyone. And I hope, especially that policymakers take it sincerely and take it to heart. So thank you guys very much.
And thank you so much. Thank you very much. I'm going to go for that wonderful send-off to Dr. Turner for the second comment. Dr. Turner.
Thanks a lot. Fortunately, my comments will be fairly brief because Stan and Warren and John have pretty much made some of the points for me. Let me just see if I can share my screen here. Sorry, this is the issues with PowerPoint. There we are. Okay. Okay, I hope people can now see the screen. Yes. Okay. So I would just echo what John has said, and this was a wonderful report. It was very informative. I don't disagree with any of the recommendations, but what I would like to do is to just mention briefly. Let me just close down these extraneous windows here. Just mention that not only did the report make many really good recommendations, and again, I would endorse John's comments that this is a sound foundation for the way forward. But what I really would like to do is to just say that the report also raises some kind of uncomfortable questions, really, about public science, how it's done, and what drives it. So the first uncomfortable question, of course, is what good is the science behind public health policy? And the conclusion, a little bit of a depressing conclusion, is that it's not really very good. There's a lot of bad scientific practice going on there. I won't go through what all those are, but let me just go on to the second uncomfortable question. There are four altogether. Is that we have to ask some fundamental questions about whether the science behind public policy does any good, or is it actually actively harmful? And John and Stan and Warren did lay out a fairly compelling case that the response to the COVID-19 pandemic had many negative effects on our society. We're still dealing with them, including arbitrary impositions on personal liberty, rather high-handed attitude from government government scientists, leading into outright censoriousness. Many cases of this. It destroyed many, or damaged anyway, many people's lives through forcing unemployment, to the point that the cure arguably was worse than the disease. And the science, I put this in quotes because I'm talking about the institutional edifice of modern science, the whole bureaucracy, network of grants, publications, and all those sorts of things. They're involved in a sort of a collusory relationship with one another that the public really doesn't have a good grasp on right now. And one of the things that I think the Shifting Science series does is it should be opening a lot of eyes elsewhere. So what I'd like to do actually is to spend my remarks talking about how did we get to this point. I mean, I'm a scientist myself. I believe in science. I think it has the potential to do enormous good, but there are certain structural problems in the architecture of modern science that I think need some attention, and it should be the object of reform. So the first thing is to say that science really isn't a monolithic enterprise. In other words, there is no the science, because science really comes in many different forms. So in the public realm, the CDC and other agencies employ large numbers of scientists as federal employees, and their principal role is to inform how essentially political goals are implemented reflective of scientific findings. So because we don't want silly rules being promulgated all the time. For example, we decided several years ago that air quality was an important area of societal concern, and somehow government had to play some role in it. And of course, government scientists in the EPA and elsewhere were responsible for helping inform the EPA on how best to address this issue. Having said that, and that's a perfectly legitimate role, but academic scientists actually are expected to play a very different role. In the original conceptions at the end of World War II of what the federal government should be supporting academic science for, one of the reasons was that academic scientists would be relatively independent from government scientists, and therefore they could provide independent checks on bad government science. And so that's the proper relationship between the two. And for that to work, two rules really have to be observed in this. First, academic science and government science have to be independent from one another. One cannot be too closely in bed with the other. And the second requirement is that both government scientists and academic scientists need to be shielded from political pressure, and political pressure is ongoing. It's almost all supported by federal expenditures, for example, and those are inherently political judgments. And of course, the problem is if those two criteria are not met, then you inevitably end up with politicized science. And that pretty much describes the situation where we are today. Science is very strongly politicized. Okay, so the next issue really is how did it come to this? And certainly there's a lot of bad science that's been promulgated by scientists on all sides. I don't want to impart any bad motives to anyone, but the fact is there is a lot of bad science being practiced out there. And it's not really because of bad motives, but because modern scientists actually operate in a certain set of incentives. And I think it was Stan who said that, yes, scientists are people too, and people respond to incentives and disincentives in the environment in which they work. And the trouble with modern science is that the incentives are mostly perverse, and these perverse incentives actually subvert the proper roles of science that I just laid out. And it's hard to escape the notion that these perverse incentives are actually have actually been brought about by what is essentially excessive federal spending on research. The federal government is now the largest funder of academic and government research in the country, and this is something that arose after World War II, for example, and it's not really kind of the normal state of affairs. Just as an example of this, here's a diagram of the research monies that were spent by the Centers for Disease Control in fiscal year 2022, and it amounts to about about $107 million that have been distributed to academic scientists and academic institutes. That $107 million was spread over 166 research grants, and it's important to point out that this is really a drop in the ocean of the federal spending of research, which runs into the hundreds of billions of dollars. And the perverse incentives come in because the system of incentives in the academy is that scientists are rewarded not for the quality of what they do, but through metrics of grants obtained and publications published, and the status of the journals where they're published, and so forth. In the meantime, government scientists, of course, and I think this is somewhat, well, I don't want to say it's appropriate, but it's understandable, is that government scientists, being public servants, they are rewarded for conformity to the executive and legislative priorities that their agencies are meant to defend. And the independence of the two are undercut because both the academic scientists and government scientists are fed by the same source, that is, out of the same CDC budget that is appropriated by government. And the end result is what we see illustrated in the Shifting Sands reports, is that there's a lot of shoddy science being published out there, and it's being published not because people are dishonest or incompetent, although those are possibilities, but because everyone in here benefits from publishing shoddy science to get the results out there quickly, to not pay too much attention to the details and so forth, because the reward is in the publications themselves. And I have to actually bring the universities in here, because part of the structure of modern science is that of the monies that are devoted to research, roughly a third of the monies are devoted to something called indirect costs, which are basically funds paid directly to universities to pay their operating costs. And in the case of the CDC alone, that amounts to about $37 million coming in, which is not a small chunk of change. And so this now comes back to what I think is the real uncomfortable question. I love all the reforms and suggestions that have come out of the Shifting Sands project, but the state of affairs came about because we actually have paid for it to come about through our legislative decisions, our appropriations to scientific research, both in government science and also in academic science. And human nature being what it is, money and power are going to play an important role in this. And some of the pathologies that John laid out, namely the lockdowns, the infringements of civil liberties, and those kinds of things, this has come about because there's actually an incentive for the science to be used as a tool for social control. And when and of course, among them is the lack of trust of government in people. We've spoken about people losing trust in their government. It works both ways because people are imagined that they're just too stupid to be able to make their own judgments. But furthermore, the structure of science funding offers lucrative material rewards to people who follow into this narrative. And of course, I would just outline the EcoHealth Alliance, science, NIH connection, which there's lots of rocks to be overturned in that still, and the rocks that have been overturned don't really point to a very nice conclusion. And of course, there are examples. I just draw this from the last moral panic that the NIH was involved in, namely HIV and AIDS, and dissent from the prevailing narrative there was punished very severely. And the example that I put in there is Peter Duisberg, who ran afoul of the AIDS establishment, so to speak, by suggesting that the connection between HIV and AIDS was not so well timed. And so modern science is really about ginning up moral panics, and this happens not just in COVID or HIV, but it happens throughout any kind of science-informed policy, which includes the climate emergency, transgenderism, and including what might be coming up as a truly deadly health crisis that will be coming up. And so the question is that how can science be made best to serve the public? And I will just point out that part of the reforms is taking a deep dive into the way that we fund science, the politics of modern federal science, and so forth, which would include perhaps not making government scientists civil servants anymore, as well as figuring out ways to restore true independence to academic scientists. And so far we don't do that. And at this point, I'm just going to give a brief plug to a new project underway at the National Association of Scholars, the Prometheus Project, which is aimed at doing just that. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So thank you to everyone for speaking, and I am thank you to the audience for listening. Now, I'm going to encourage people to do the questions now. I've seen actually, I'm looking, I see a fair number of comments. Is there a way to get involved with the Prometheus project? Oh, well, that's great. You should, well, the easiest way to do is get in touch with Scott Turner at nas.org. I'll just answer that one quickly. And you email him and see what you can do. I will just say there is a series of comments from Richard Belzer, one of which is important is, in 2002, the Office of Management and Budget published guidelines on information quality. Agencies do not comply because, one, it would destroy their business models, and two, non-compliance is not subject to judicial review. And then later, compliance with the information quality guidelines would solve 90% of the problem. And this does bring up, how should I put this, an issue which we would have mulled about as we're writing our reports, but how much of what is needs to be recommended to government as experts as they do their work in these agencies, how much of it is simply do what the regulations already ask you to do, how much of it is we need more regulations, and how much of it is it doesn't matter what regulations you put in if people, in government simply don't comply with them. And if they are, what is the recommendation that follows up from that? For which everybody will have, these are broad questions, but may I ask any or all of you to speak to that, or some aspect of these broad questions?
I'll jump in because I've been pestering NIH for years. Make the data available, make the analysis code available. And so I'm in full agreement with Richard that if people would comply, now 6 or 8 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, NIH had wonderful lip service on their website about making data available. I kept pestering, and it turned out that, well, they were just advising scientists to make their data available and so forth. The crucial data was epidemiology data, health data. And that was protected in various and sundry ways. One way the EPA protected it was that they would let the research to a university, and then wink, wink, nod, nod, they would tell the university, don't give the data to anyone. So FAI could not reach through the EPA or any government agency and go to the university and get the data. So it's a wonderful thing. I think totally unworkable is to leave it up to the good graces of the university professors to make their data available. They basically will not do it. They have not done it. They've been admonished to do it. They've been told to do it. But there are no cops. There's no one checking up on them. NIH has gotten better. Now you have to file what you're going to do with your data when you ask for a grant. But this has been like watching glaciers go uphill. It's been very, very slow and very, very ineffective. It is you've hit a hot button. Office of Research Integrity is supposed to be watching the integrity of grant spending and so forth and so on. Only if you show up and show that someone has fabricated data will they become involved. I've asked them to look at, proactively use p-value plots and things like that to sort of search out shoddy data, shoddy reports, and they will not do it. So they are absent without leave. The scientists are not going to do it on their own. It's a wonderful suggestion, but there's no teeth anywhere that I can see.
Anybody else amongst the speakers or panelists wish to speak to this?
Well, there was a question in Q&A about how is there a role for inspectors generals in modifying this? And I can't really speak to the adherence to scientific integrity other than what Stan has already pointed out, but there have been various attempts to bring spending under some kind of rational control, most notably in indirect costs. This has been an ongoing issue with science funding in Congress, and no matter what seems to happen, the ship seems to sail on unperturbed. There's a lot of political influence in this, and it tends to be very persuasive to members of Congress, and so they're very. I'm not sure there's a lot of interest in this kind of oversight among the scientific community and the university community.
I'm going to just mention that Richard Belzer has a further comment on this, which is, agencies will comply if Congress codified the OMB guidelines and statute, with the additional provision that agency compliance is subject to judicial review. Instead of relying on people to do the right thing, the guidelines provide a way for third parties to challenge government information that is non-compliant, with the remedy being removal from dissemination. I am just going to say, this brings up, frankly, another one of my own bugaboos, judicial education in science combined with judicial deference to government agencies. It's really important to have judges and lawyers be educated about statistics, science, the irreproducibility crisis. I'm in favor of your reforms to legal education, continuing legal education, to get more of this information in. I will say that judges have an awful lot to learn just learning the law, so it's a little unfair to them to make them learn all of science as well. Nevertheless, there is a strong case to be made for it. However, also there's then the question of judicial deference to agencies. And how shall I put this? I strongly suspect judges want to defer to the government, and to be told, no, you've got to doubt them as well. It is a challenge, is all I'm going to say to Mr. Belzer in the chat comments. Are there, by the way, more questions and answers from people? I know that Kathleen Lowry looked like she was going to have a question, ask a question. Is other people want to speak to the subject, however, before we get to that? I am going to then ask a question about civil liberties in particular. What is the best way what is the best way to educate scientists about civil liberties? I mean, part of this problem seems to be a certain callous unconcern, or you're just not thinking about it. But how do we educate scientists to be more attentive to civil liberty questions? Going on.
Yeah, let me jump in here. If you look at the backstories that are just coming out now, the lawsuit between Missouri and the government and so forth, the scientists within the government itself were very much part of the problem. I often wonder about my representative in Congress. Has she actually read the Constitution? And although she swore to defend the Constitution, give me one example where she's actually done it. Scientists and some of our best science journals are cheerleaders for the current system. They're not out there saying, "Oh, you scientists are doing something that's violating civil liberties." Fauci and Collins, for example, conspired to take down the Great Barrington Declaration. Well, how much can you fight civil liberties if you're taking down a scientific discussion by acknowledged experts? So the examples of violations of civil liberties are all over the place. Just read the lawsuit between Missouri and Louisiana against Biden. And so it's I don't remember. I remember in industry a person defending civil liberties where I worked one time. They said, "No, we're not going to do that because it's unethical." But I have not seen the same level of in industry. If you don't make a product that works, you go out of business. So there's financial incentive to do it right. You may not be doing it right because you're trying to protect civil liberties, but you're trying to do it right because you yourself will be hurt if you don't do it right. Most university professors, their university will protect them until the last inch, and then, if necessary, they'll throw them under the bus. But the universities, I've talked to people at universities that are in charge of this sort of thing, ethical this and that, and it's not good, not a good system right now, as all of us have acknowledged.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt any possible follow-up answers simply because I now see Kathleen Lowry's question and I want to read it so that people can have a chance to answer that. She writes, listening to these talks, it is striking that the speakers are concerned with the failures of natural scientists. What has been striking to me has been a parallel failure of social scientists. COVID was like something Foucault could have dreamed up to illustrate his ideas about power/knowledge. And yet the entire social scientific world of scholarship was very boosterish about using it to regulate the citizenry, with the noble exception of Agamben, who got it in the neck for his pains. What do you think explains this paired failures when the social scientists are the ones who are exactly supposed to be experts in this kind of social construction of science? Question mark. I have some answers myself, but first I'm going to ask everybody else. Anybody want to answer this?
I'll jump in. And it actually is following up on Stan's comments just a moment ago. I I'm fairly generous about attributing bad motives to fellow scientists, but in the case of the COVID-19 pandemic, one of the things that I saw coming out again and again was a common failing of academics, which is that they imagine that they're smarter than everyone else, and this leads to a certain contemptuous attitude towards the general public and the people who are supporting them and actually writing the checks. And I've seen this among my natural scientist colleagues. You know, I don't have as much experience with the social scientists, but I imagine the same kind of arrogant attitude applies to that. And so I think that maybe the thing to do is to make lessons in humility as part of the training of academic scientists, and perhaps even make it one of the required courses in the training of PhDs, because the sheer arrogance is rampant. And in the case of the COVID-19 thing, of course, you saw this in the pronouncements of Anthony Fauci, that I am the science. You saw it in the case of his bulldog, Peter Hotez, who made some of the most outrageous claims about people who are opposing the narrative, and you know, that I think is a common failure through academia. We are trained to think that we're smarter than everyone else, and the judgment of ordinary people and how to live their lives is not really worth very much.
This
Anyone
would
else?
be as much of an answer as it's going to be a commentary, but one of the things that they stressed that was stressed to us as Americans from the beginning was, you know, we're all in this together.
Mm-hmm.
But it became pretty doggone evident from the beginning that while we may all be in this, it was just the public health establishment that had any say over what was going to be gone. When you're shutting down people's jobs, economists should have been talked to. Psychologists should have been talked to. When you're kicking kids out of school, they definitely should have been talking to child psychologists and educationists. But so many different fields of knowledge were impacted, and we were left without hearing from anybody who could have had something to say or something to add to that. So, you know, this Hayekian dispersed knowledge was never tapped into. And so that was one of the biggest problems that I saw.
I'm just going to add, there's actually like a completely different failure of the social scientists, which needs to be mentioned, which is they're actually doing the same sort of horrible stuff that the natural scientists are doing, except with much worse data, with far lower power. I mean, I will mention for an upcoming report, people in psychology who test 30 students in one of their classes and think that they've got something which is going to get statistical significance or something. So there's an awful lot of social scientists who are practicing with far greater error, than the natural scientists, which is something to be mentioned. It is weird how there is this sort of bias towards authority. I think one specific subdiscipline that needs to be called out is something called science, technology, and society studies, which is a particular aspect of, in effect, social science, studies of science, which is terribly much in favor of, in effect, when there's an emergency, you need to act suddenly without regard for scientific caution. I think this comes out largely out of the polemics about the, quote unquote, climate change. And in fact, it's meant to be a sort of a polemic saying we should act now, even when there's, the science is dodgy. But in effect, a large number of social scientists who specifically study science are part of this STS subdiscipline, which is oddly bent towards act now, doubt later. I will say it is very strange reading things from a previous generation. For example, Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, who did a great deal wrong. But what's weird is that she is the one who's there arguing, to doubt the professional scientists, to trust your own amateur judgment. There's been a almost total change in the attitude. I must say, as far as I can tell, entirely driven by politics without any intellectual inconsistency. But if there is anything to talk about, there is a real generational change between 1960 and 2023. So anyway, sorry, that's a longish bit to answer Kathleen Lowry. Did anybody else want to add to that?
Well, I have a quick comment. It's very short. Cut off their money.
I'm sorry, what did you say?
Cut off their money.
This may be a sort of a consensus view here.
Yes.
It is 3:29. Compared with most of our launches, this is slightly longer on the presentation, slightly shorter on the Q&A. I'm going to bring this, therefore, to our conclusion now. I'm first going to say to all of the people in the audience, thank you so much. We do this for you. Your questions help and comments help make this possible. We don't want the questions and comments to end. Please send any further ones you have to me, randall@nas.org. That's RANDALL@nas.org. And I'll be delighted to forward your questions to any speaker, any panelist, indeed all of them. So the conversation does not end at 3:30. To the speakers and the panelists, thank you. Thank you so much. I think that's especially a thank you to our panelists, our commenters, John, Scott, very grateful to you. Grateful to everybody. I'm going to have, therefore, some final bits of advertisement. So one, this will appear within 24 hours on the NAS website for anybody to see in perpetuity. If you want to click on the web link and send it on to everybody you know, go for it. Two, we have all sorts of web series done at the NAS, including one on the history of American science, American inventions, which is going on as we speak. So I encourage you to take a look for various of our webinars, the invention of the telephone, for example, coming up soon. We also have webinars run by Scott Turner on various aspects of modern science policy. You should be watching all of those as well. I mean, how should I put it? There's an enormous discussion of modern science. The irreproducibility crisis is only one aspect of it. There's these wonderful broad-ranging conversations. Please come in to look at those. And this is the third of 4 reports on the irreproducibility crisis. We will be having a 4th one, which will be on, speaking of social science, psychology and implicit bias and the implicit attitude test. That will be coming up, coming forward, and concluding things is going to, in effect, tie together a great deal of our research in shifting sands with the Prometheus project. It's all a grand synergy. So teasing bits on an enormous amount of stuff on science research and science policy coming forward from the NAS. It's the question of science policy and the reproducibility crisis is a first order question for the American Republic. And Warren and Canada, the Dominion of Canada as well. We need to pay very close attention to it. It doesn't come second. It's just as important as the economy, as the culture war, as defense. Science really matters, and how we govern how the American Republic governs the Republic of Science absolutely is a first order issue. So I'm going to leave you with a call to arms to pay attention to all this stuff. Again, everybody, thank you so much. It's been delightful being a moderator, and I'm very grateful to everyone. Thank you so much.